Hello, welcome again to our chapter by chapter devotional through the entire Bible. This morning we're going to be in Genesis chapter 17. I'll give you a summary, as always, of what happens in this chapter, along with some spiritual truths, some spiritual principles to consider. In verses 1 through 8, what we have is another repeat of God's promises to Abraham. God's promise of offspring, God's promise of land, God's promise that he will be a blessing on the nation. At this time, to reinforce that promise, God has renamed Abram to Abraham because he's going to be the father of many. Now, you have to keep in mind, this is now 23 years after that initial promise, and to this point, there's no land and there's no children in the way that God has promised. Now, I find it very interesting that we covered about 6 chapters of the life of Abraham so far. We started in Genesis chapter 12, and this is the 4th time that God has repeated that promise, that truth. God originally told him when he was getting ready to leave the land of Ur. God repeated that promise after he separated from Lot, and Lot seemed to take the better land. God repeated that promise after Abraham rejected Sodom's riches. And then God repeats this promise now after the Hagar incident that was based on doubt. So it's just showing us that we all need to be strengthened repeatedly by the same truths of God's Word. We need reminders. We're not always looking for something new. Many times what we need is what we already know. We just need to be reminded of it. We need to have it reinforced in our life. Well, that's what God does for Abraham. He reinforces and reminds him of the truth and the promises that God will do for him. Now in verses 9 through 14, we see that God institutes the rite of circumcision as a sign of the covenant for Abraham and for all his descendants, the people of Israel. We're told in verse 10, God says this is my covenant which you shall keep between me and you and your offspring after you. Every male among you shall be circumcised. Now, circumcision was a physical expression, a way of saying, I'm totally committed to the Lord. I'm sold out to him. He is my only God. It's not a perfect example, but a wedding ring, it's also a sign of a covenant. It's a sign of a marriage covenant. It's a reminder to us each day as we wear our wedding rings that we're in a committed relationship with one person for the entirety of our lives. Well, that's what circumcision was. It was a reminder to the people of Israel they were in a committed relationship, totally sold out to God. Now in verses 15 through 19, God once again promises that Sarah is going to have a child. Not Hagar, but Sarah, the way God originally intended. And Abraham doubts this promise, and instead of believing God's promise at this point, he prays for God to bless his human efforts, the efforts of his flesh, his son Ishmael. Here's what happens. Genesis 17, verse 16. God is speaking. He says, I will bless her, Sarah, and moreover I will give you a son by her. I will bless her, and she shall become nations. Kings of people shall come from her. Then Abraham fell on his face and laughed and said to himself, Shall a child be born to a man who is 100 years old? Shall Sarah, who is 90 years old, bear a child? And Abraham said to God, Oh, that Ishmael might live before you. And God said, No, but Sarah, your wife, shall bear you a son, and you shall call his name Isaac. I will establish my covenant with him as an everlasting covenant for his offspring after him. So we see God reinforcing that he's going to do a miracle, that he's going to keep his word literally, exactly as he said. And Abraham externally seems to have a deep respect, reverence, and trust in God. He bows down before him. He falls down on his face before him. But if you notice, inwardly he doubts. Now this is a failure on Abraham's part. He was a great man of faith, but he also faltered at times, just like you and I falter at times. And sometimes we have outward belief like Abraham did, but inwardly we say to ourselves, there's no way. This can't happen. And we don't believe God's word, even though we may express outwardly that we do. And hopefully you and I will learn from that lesson and trust God fully that he will keep his promises. We'll see in the next couple of chapters how God does that. And then finally at the end of this chapter, we see that Abraham does obey God in regard to circumcision. It says in Genesis 17, verse 26, that very day, the same day God spoke to him, that very day Abraham and his son Ishmael were circumcised, and all the men of his house, those born in the house and those bought with money from a foreigner, were circumcised with him. This is something you see repeatedly in the life of Abraham. God tells him to do something, and he does it. He does it wait. He doesn't deliberate in his mind. He simply does it. And that's important for us, because I want us to understand that in most cases, delayed obedience is really disobedience. Delayed obedience is disobedience. So if God's speaking to your heart, if God's showing you something in his word and you're waiting for the perfect time to do it, if you're waiting for a better time to do it, you're making a huge mistake. We're to obey God when he tells us to do these things. I hope this has been a blessing to you. Have a great day.